can I please bring on Kamya Chandra, the Chief Strategy Officer at the Center for Digital Public Infrastructures, who's been doing better, cheaper, faster. Kamya, tell us how.
This is on? Yeah, okay, great. Can you guys hear me clearly? So I think Pramod has told you kind of what the next 6 years, 5 to 6 years should look like. I want to talk you through what you can do in 6 weeks if you're working in a country. Because I think we have to span both of those horizons. We have to think 6 years, 10 years ahead, and we have to think what can we get done to affect millions of lives in the next 6 weeks. So I'm Kamya, I'm from the Center for Digital Public Infrastructure, which Pramod is the co-chair of. And we sort of provide pro bono technology architecture advice. But this idea of DaaS or DPI as a packaged solution, this thinking about how do we drive rapid deployment is actually not a CDPI effort. You see all of these logos, I think most of the logos on that screen, plus the ones on the top, have all come together in sort of an ecosystem approach, because DPIs are about ecosystems. They're not ever about just one logo. So what have we seen in countries? We've seen that the path to DPI implementation is full of potholes, right? Well, you have issues around timelines because of the timeline of procurement, the timeline to get funding approval, right, which I'm sure will be discussed in the breakout room. You have technology vendor issues and concerns, corrections, calibrations, change requests, famously, across the sector. You have hiring, you have capacity issues. All of these are major challenges that are preventing countries from saying, hey, this is a great idea. This is a great concept. We know it's been done before in so many countries around the world, from Brazil to Estonia to Singapore to India to Thailand and beyond. How do we get something like this for the baseline identities, payments, data sharing that can actually get deployed in a short period of time? So the intent to implement is no longer in question. There's at least 35 countries that we are talking to personally, and between the World Bank with 50 plus active projects, UNDP with 40, 50 countries active projects, it's very clear that the countries have intent. The question is now, how do we get to rapid, right? And in order to get to rapid, we want you to think of two separate pieces. Let's see if we can separate the problem out. There's one side of the problem, which is sort of a greenfield implementation. You're starting from scratch, multi-million-dollar project. You have to enroll maybe 50 million people into a new system. You have to start a new payment system completely from scratch. Let's put those aside, because counterintuitively, most countries are not starting from scratch. Most countries already have digital assets that they actually can just build on. They already have some ID system that's functioning in the country. They have some payments infrastructure. They have some paper certificates as a method of data sharing, or even digital certificates, PDFs, that they're using to generate land records, or they're using to give you your social benefits, or they're using to register marriages and licenses, right, of all kinds. Our question is, if we focus on that right side, can we rapidly upgrade an existing digital infrastructure? Let's say you have an ID system. Let's add a digital authentication mechanism, a digital mechanism to share those profile data fields to anyone else in the ecosystem who can reuse it. Let's start with a digital credential or certificate that Pramod talked about and add a digitally signed QR code on it, so that paper that's so easy to travel across borders with becomes a digital public infrastructure for the person and a mechanism of data sharing. Can we unlock these kinds of rapid deployments? And our thinking here is that this rapid upgrade section, these can be prepackaged very well in order to avoid these risks, right? The risks of security issues, privacy vulnerabilities, the risks of vendor lock-in and vendor challenges, the risks of technology architecture errors in framing it. In order to minimize those risks and to drive speed and scale across the 50 plus countries that want to implement this in a rapid time, we think the pre-packaging is key. Now, what do we mean when we say pre-packaging? First is the technology part. What does that mean? It just means reusable code, right? It can be open source code. It can be even code share on a bilateral arrangement from one entity to another, but the code doesn't have to be recreated from scratch. It also means you can leverage, if you choose, public or private clouds, right? So hyperscalers in the room can be used for hosted solutions, but that's not mandated. You can also host it on premises if you have your own servers, or if you have some form of private cloud. All three when your technology hardware infrastructure is ready and the code is reusable, your tech can be pre-packaged to minimize mistakes and errors. But the technology providers who have these packages can't scale themselves to 50, 100 countries to the demand, because that's just too large an ask of them. So how do we get them to move faster? The next step is teams. They have to train private service provider teams to say, actually, this is how you deploy my package, right? So with an ecosystem of pre-trained private service providers, many of whom are in this room and have gone through the training, by the way, you can actually choose your army as a country, right? You can say, I don't just want this pre-packaged technology, I want a program team, I want that team to know how to deploy this specific building block in the DPI approach. It's been certified as a trained service provider on the pre-packaged technology. But that team sometimes has to also be made sure that they're enabled with the right building blocks so that they don't make mistakes either, right? And for that, we created a bunch of standard artifacts, a standard playbook to, again, minimize the scope for mistakes, to increase speed, and to drive scale. This includes a standardized scope documentation, standardized framing of how big the team should be and what capacity, role, job titles should be on the team. It includes thinking around what the governance on the team should be, who's in the steering committee, who's in the program committee, how often should the program team meet versus the steering committee meet, right? A short policy paper template, a standard costing model. These kinds of artifacts are the things that ensure that allow those pre-trained teams to actually succeed. Fourth, the governance arrangements between all of the teams that interact with each other, legal partnerships, cannot be underestimated. So for this, we've put together sort of shared ecosystem participation terms that say all of the service providers in this ecosystem commit to these guidelines on cybersecurity, on individual privacy, on protecting the country's interests, on contributing back to the open source code in case there are changes that are made, and so on, to prevent technology risks from taking off. It also includes standardized bilateral agreements between a country and a technology provider, between the technology open reusable code provider and a private service provider, and so on. So you minimize the time for the lawyers to get in the room and spend their weeks, right? and earn their share in that sense. And finally, funding. This is the piece of the puzzle where we're aiming for 2 weeks for a country approval. Our thinking is, if you've gone through all of the 4 stages before that, where you've pre-packaged the tech, pre-packaged the process, reduced the risks, as well as templatized the implementation, the funding approval doesn't have to be as long as it is per country, right? You do it at a national or at an international level, at a program level, and you say, all right, this country wants to deploy this standard product. This is not rocket science to me anymore, so you can fast track it. And thankfully, we've sort of, with co-developed support, raised about $2 million to start with for the first 2, and we're hoping to raise more for the additional round of countries that are coming in. I think this sounds like a lot. It sounds like, it sounds like a unicorn pipe dream, right? But this work has been going on for the last 8 months. The Carnegie Summit in December, the Global Technology Summit, was where the paper between Rahul, Rudra, Pramod, and Madhukar co-authored was released on DaaS. And following that, a bunch of those artifacts that I showed you in this slide have actually been put together in their first draft. They're all available to comment on in public. And there's already been 4 private service providers that have been trained. Actually, raise your hand if you're in the, I know Enison is here. You guys have been trained there, I see. So there's a bunch of folks in the room as well who's already been trained. In terms of the cloud providers as well who have come on, I saw Rohini here earlier, other partners from GCP and others, excited about the opportunity to offer this as a choice. And the reason that all of these logos, again, are important is because we don't think that any one institution or any one mechanism can actually scale to support all of the countries in this ecosystem without working with others in the group. We think the big tent approach is really the only way where we're going to get collaboration and good kinds of competition, in place between private service providers in partnership with funding and other kinds of support. The final point I'll make is that country work has already begun. Brazil, who I think is in the room, Trinidad and Tobago have already started on this journey. and are aiming to go live before the year ends. And there's countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America that are focusing on the design. So the last thing I'll leave you with is, if you'd like to co-create on this with us, please scan that QR code to get to that 50 plus countries, 500 million people, really able to reuse something in their life and see this change within the year, right? And not just as something on a PowerPoint slide. But thank you so much.
Thanks.